Hello, welcome back to Calvary Christian School after your spring break. I know it wasn't exactly what everybody had planned, but we're back to classes now, and that's a good thing. So, we are going to finish up chapter 15 pretty quickly here. Actually, we have a long time to go. We're back in chapter 15, and we're going to be working on the English Renaissance. Remember that the English got the Renaissance a little later than everybody else because they were so far west. They also got the Reformation a little later than everybody else because they were so far west. And they adopted the Reformation not because of a specific conviction that the Protestant way was right. It was done specifically because Henry VIII wanted to marry someone other than his first wife, who was a Catholic woman, very well connected. Catherine of Aragon was. He was also a very staunch, very strict Catholic. So when he chose to create a new church in England, called the Church of England, he was considered Protestant, but he kept a lot of the same ideas of the faith when it came to Catholicism. So the Church of England was very Catholic in tone, Catholic in practice, and yet it was very it was still considered Protestant because he made himself the head of the English Church instead of the Pope being the head of his church. Okay, so we are starting off today with, come on, there we go. The Book of Common Prayer. This was a lot like the Catholic Missal that we've talked about before. It led Protestants in their church services, and it was made up of prayers that were spoken or sung. It's not an unusual thought that the Protestants would choose a format that was very similar to Catholicism because for many of them, that's all they had ever known, including Henry VIII. But we are to the point now where Henry VIII had already married Catherine of Aragon, divorced her because he considered that their relationship could be seen as incestuous by the Catholic Church, even though he had previously fought for that marriage because she had been married to his brother who died. And he had fought saying, look, it's a biblical thing that I marry my brother's wife. Even though they've never had any kind of sexual relationship because he died on their honeymoon. He's like, so I'm using that biblical standard. And then on top of that, he gave a lot of money to the Catholic Church. Mary's family wanted the marriage to take place, so they gave a lot of money and a lot of support to the Catholic Church. Then after Arthur died and Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII got married, they had one child, a little girl that lived. Her name was Mary. And then after that, there were years and years and years of miscarriages. For what reason, we don't have an exact knowledge, but we do know that it was very common for especially women of noble rank and royal rank to drink wine throughout the day. That was considered the proper drink to drink, and it may have had an issue. There may have been an issue there with alcohol poisoning for the fetus. So she was not able to give him a male heir, so he divorced her using the idea that, okay, maybe I was wrong when I fought for the right to get married to my late brother's wife, and maybe God is punishing me by not letting me have a boy. So he went to the Catholic Church and said, please, please, please let me divorce my wife. And they said, no, she's very well connected. We aren't going to offend her or her family. To divorce that couple would mean that Mary would be claimed illegitimate. So he instead broke from the Catholic Church, divorced her in his new religion of Protestantism via the Church of England, and then married Anne Boleyn, who was a Protestant in conviction. When she gave birth to a little girl, Elizabeth, Henry got very angry. He tried to encourage her to get pregnant again right away. She had a miscarriage that sent him over the edge, and he declared that she was cheating on him. So he had her beheaded with a sword. She specifically requested a sword since axes were notoriously dull. She's the one that had the sword go through her jaw instead of through her neck. So he got rid of her. and sent Elizabeth off to be raised by family members elsewhere in England. Then he married his third wife, Jane Seymour, who did give birth to his male heir, Edward VI. Unfortunately, she died during childbirth. So for Henry, he has lived this life where he's just married, divorced, or had a woman die in childbirth. And then he went on to marry 3 other women, and again, divorced, had them executed, and one outlived him. She's the lucky one. But once he passed away, the throne was then supposed to go to his son, Edward VI, who was still very, very young. So he was raised by the Protestant leaders in the country of England. And we're going to see a very different outlook on how this king was raised. He was raised by Protestant leaders in England, but they still respected, in fact, they very much respected the way the government was set up in England, which was there was a parliament who basically kept the king accountable to the people. There's going to be another king who's raised in 2 generations from there, who is going to be raised by the Protestant leaders of his nation, and they're going to see themselves as being more important than the Scottish government, and they're going to raise him in such a way that he is going to see himself as he's going to see himself as the ultimate, God put me in this position, so therefore everybody must do what I say because I am God's representative on earth, which is not how Edward VI was at all. So during Henry's time, the Book of Common Prayer was published, but after Henry died, and then right after that, when he was only 16 years old, Edward VI died. He died of tuberculosis. It was a very horrible disease where basically you feel like you're drowning in your own tissues because your lungs are disintegrating from tuberculosis. So after he died, then Parliament was scrambling who was going to be the next on the throne. Now they looked at Henry's line. They looked at his daughter Mary, but because they had divorced, according to Catholic tradition, that everybody had already been aware of, they said, well, she's considered illegitimate because of the divorce. And then they looked at Elizabeth. They said, well, her mom was executed for adultery, so we're going to take her out because there's no, if her mom was executed for adultery, then we could say that she's possibly not Henry's daughter, even though they looked very much alike. So they looked instead at Henry's sister's line. And this is the first time we're going to see in English history where they're going to break with Salic law that they had kept up with for so long. Because the original kings of England, starting with William the Conqueror, were also French subjects, they kept a lot of the French ideas of government, including Salic law, which meant that only the male line could rule. So this is going to be the first time that they break with Salic law, and they're going to put this young woman on the throne. Her name is Lady Jane Grey. She was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's sister. Okay, so she was, or niece, I believe it was, the daughter of his niece. She was a devout Christian. She was a follower of Protestant teachings. She spoke fluent Greek and Hebrew. And she was placed on the throne after Edward VI's death by English Protestant leaders. And they expected her to basically be their puppet, but she ended up having quite a bit of a backbone. And she had very clear ideas of how she wanted to rule, how she wanted to lead, and how she wanted to bring England into more glorious days. The Parliament and the English people felt that the regents of Edward VI had gone way too far. They felt that they had just skipped over the line of Henry. And you had a lot of people who were really frustrated by the fact that Henry had left the Catholic Church, because a lot of people in England were angry that they had to leave the Catholic Church because their king did. So they wanted a Catholic on the throne. Okay, some did, some didn't. But they thought that the Parliament was trying to overthrow the Tudor family. And so they gave their support instead to Henry VIII's daughter, Mary. And later on, Mary had Jane beheaded. it was at the behest of her husband, Philip II of Spain. So Mary gets married to Philip II of Spain, whose whole goal is to eventually take over the world and make the whole world Catholic in the name of the Catholic Church. He refused to marry Mary until she put Jane to death. Jane was safe until that point, because according to Mary's philosophy, this is family. She was put on the throne by regents, by parliament. She was still very young. She was only 16 years old. Mary was willing to forgive and forget, but once it came between her and Philip II, she chose Philip, and she had Mary put to death. I'm sorry, she had Jane put to death. And you've seen this playing in my classroom as part of my art slideshow. This is the death of Lady Jane Grey. She became very, very close to the Catholic confessor that was sent to her in prison while she was in prison in the Tower of London, the White Tower of London, which was a jail as well as a palace. She became very close to that Catholic confessor. The two of them debated. She never converted to Catholicism. He never converted to Protestantism, but they did talk about Scripture. They talked about God. They talked about the right way to believe. The two of them would have these long debates with each other. He went with her to the beheading block. You can see there in front of her. And this is one of those heartbreaking moments. She was ready to die for her belief. She was given the option of walking away from her belief in Christ and grace, salvation through Christ alone. She was willing to stand up for her belief as a Protestant. She was not willing to convert to Catholicism. She was given that option and she said no. But her confessor went with her to the chopping block. And once she was there, they put the blindfold on her, had her kneel, and then told her to lay her head on the block. Well, she was blindfolded by that time, so she was groping for it blindly, looking for this block to lay her head down so that she could be executed. And she began to weep a little, and she said, I can't find it. I can't find it. Someone help me. And her confessor, who had debated with her, who they didn't agree on the same biblical standard, and yet they had great respect for one another. He is the one who stepped forward and helped her find the block that was in front of her. And she laid her head down and was killed. She was a martyr for her cause. Now, after Lady Jane Grey was executed, Mary Tudor, this is Henry VIII's Catholic daughter, became Queen of England in 1553. She was firmly resolved to return England back to the Catholic Church and make England a Catholic nation once again. And part of that was because of her marriage to Philip II, but a lot of it was her personal conviction that this was the right way to worship God. So she was very staunchly a Catholic. Now, she was given the nickname Bloody Mary because there were 300 people in government who refused to return to Romanism. They refused to return to the Catholic Church and therefore were killed for their convictions. One of those, of course, is Lady Jane Grey. So these 300 people were Protestant leaders who absolutely refused to give up their stance that the Protestant way of worship was the right way to worship. So she had 300 of those people killed, including Cranmer, Ridley, and Latimer, who were all the regents who helped to raise Edward VI and who put Lady Jane on the throne. Now, the nickname Bloody Mary is really a misnomer. This was a name given to her by her enemies after they won, because after Mary dies, her Protestant sister is going to be put on the throne. And in history, looking back at this Catholic queen who had 300 executions take place, they're going to name her Bloody Mary as a way of solidifying Elizabeth's political station. Elizabeth killed 3 times the people that Mary did. but for a different reason. Mary killed people in the name of her religious convictions. Elizabeth executed people based on the fact that they were trying to overthrow her, which is a very different way of thinking of it. Now, it was right around Mary's time that John Foxe, an English historian, he wrote about the Christian persecution that was going on during the time of Mary's reign. And during Mary's reign, Mary wed Philip II of Spain, and he brought the Spanish Inquisition with him. Okay. So John Foxe wrote down it's a very long book. It's about this thick. You can get it thinner where they've taken some of it out. But he wrote this book called Foxe's Book of Martyrs. And this classic book has been read by people in every generation since his time, where he goes all the way back to the very beginning of the church, the Christian church, after Christ was crucified and resurrected and ascended to heaven, and then the very first martyr, who was Stephen, and then he wrote about all of the different martyrs during the times of the Romans, and then during the times of the Crusades, and then during these purges by Catholic leaders who disagreed with how people were to worship. And so he wrote this Foxe's Book of Martyrs. It was written in 1563. And it goes all the way up through to Mary's time of killing the three Protestant leaders of her day. It has been updated consistently since it was first published. This one is all the way up to the 21st century, so it's just a little bit behind. But one of the interesting things about Foxe and his book is he often records the last words of people, exactly what they were tried for, how they were tried, how they were executed. It is a very interesting read. Okay, going on to Elizabeth. After Mary's death, and she died of natural causes. She wasn't killed or anything. Elizabeth I was the Protestant daughter of Henry VIII. She was more tolerant of differing religions because she saw how it had really torn her family apart. And she ended up earning the nickname Good Queen Bess. Now, again, this is politically savvy. When your queen on the throne, you don't want to call her names. Okay, Mary got the name Bloody Mary a little bit later on. I don't think they called her that to her face. But Elizabeth nicknamed Good Queen Bess. But remember, she did have quite a few people executed under her reign. It was really under her name. And then she had to sign the death warrant that for people that her Parliament told her, these people tried to overthrow you. And there were quite a few people who tried to overthrow Elizabeth, unfortunately, over 1,000. But she was constantly under attack by those who wanted to establish their own beliefs. So she was more tolerant of differing views on religions, and she really opened up England for the opportunity to debate and discuss rather than just kill because people believed differently. So she created the Elizabeth Settlement. This was a series of laws in which the officially established many Protestant doctrines and practices, laying the foundation for the Anglican Church. It went away from Catholicism more so than when her father had been ruling. But this Elizabeth Settlement laid this is what we believe and why. It is a doctrinal statement. Okay, just really quick note here on the art we're looking at. Let's look at this one. This was created when she was about 14 to 16 years old. You can see she's seen pictured with her pearls to show her rank. Her headdress is also very important. She's also got books to show her intelligence, because intelligence was an important thing for people when they were being painted. They wanted people to know that they were well educated. You will note that her clothing is quite elaborate and beautifully done. It's heavily dyed and embroidered. The slashing that you see on near the wrists of her sleeves, that was a very common technique, especially in her father's day. That was a really big deal, where they would have a jerkin, that's something they wore over an undershirt, and then they would pull the little pieces of undershirt through so you could see the silk undershirt. Under this dress, she would have been wearing multiple petticoats. This wasn't just for modesty. That, in fact, most of it wasn't for modesty. It was for warmth. It was very, very cold. Okay, they didn't have a lot of insulation, and they didn't have central heating, so the cold was a big issue. Okay, when we get to this part, you'll notice the big difference between her face as a young woman. It's very realistic, and then you get to this part where it's very not realistic. It's almost cartoonish. As she got older, she wanted to present herself always as a queen who was of the people and of her time. And so she was very concerned about how she looked as she aged. So she tended to wear a lot of very white makeup, which unfortunately was lead-based, which meant that there was going to be issues with joint pain and skin disease as well. So what typically happened with a lot of these people who lived during this time when they wore that white lead-based paint, and they had the joint issues and the skin disease, as the skin would develop sores, they would just put more paint over them just to kind of cover it up. And this is one of the reasons why why people died so young. There was another phrase I was going to use there, and I would just went blank. Why people died so young, they didn't have the lifespan. That's what I was looking for, the lifespan that we know and love today. And a lot of it was because of what they were using on their bodies for cosmetic purposes. So she was using a lead-based white paint, and then her hair was naturally red as a young woman, but she went very gray early. That's kind of common among redheads. And so she started dyeing her hair with henna, which turns red. Okay. When she was painted, she had herself painted with very elaborate gowns. The sleeves on this thing are crazy. Look at those sleeves. Oh my goodness, they call them leg of mutton sleeves. Those are crazy gray. She has bows all over her. She's draped in pearls, and then there is a flatness to her face. Everything else is seen really in almost like 3D if you really look at the shadows and everything, but her face is very flat. She purposely wanted to be painted that way so you couldn't see her age. Okay, the Anglican Church. This was also known as the Church of England. The Catholics opposed it because they said it was too Protestant. The Protestants opposed it because they said it was too Catholic. That's all you need to know. Then there were bunches of people who also opposed it because it didn't agree with their specific way of worship. So you're going to have a lot of people who are dissenting against the Anglican Church or Church of England. The Puritans wanted to purify the Church of England. That's how they got that name. The Separatists wanted to be separate from the official church altogether and to worship independently in their own congregations. Okay, Mary Stuart. She became Queen of Scotland when she was 1 week old. Again, this is where Salic law is going to be ignored for the first time. Scotland was its own country, still is, but they're connected to the UK. But during Mary's time, her father was King of Scotland. Her mother was a French princess who became the Queen Consort of Scotland. When Mary's dad passed away in a battle, Mary became queen, even though she was only 1 week old. But her mother, very concerned that Mary was going to be endangered or that someone would try to force their regency on her, her mom sent her off to be raised by her aunt, who was the mother's sister in France. The mom's name was Mary of Guise. So she was regent of Mary Stuart. She wanted to keep Scotland Catholic. She was closely allied with France because that's where her sister was the Queen of France and had several children who were trying to keep France Catholic as well. So she sent her daughter to France to be raised in the court and to be prepared to marry her cousin, Francis, who is the heir to the French throne. There's a lot of Marys coming up. I'm just giving you for a warning. Okay, so Mary of Guise loses her husband, gives up her baby when her baby's only a week old, finds herself now the regent of a queen who's not even on location anymore and is surrounded by Protestant leaders who want to take over the country for themselves. So she is under a lot of stress and a lot of attack, really, it's going on. The Scottish Reformation had begun with John Knox, who started out as a Catholic priest, but became Protestant. He had a long, convoluted history with England and Scotland, but Scottish Reformation opened very violently because John Knox wanted this to be a revolution. He wanted to completely get rid of Catholicism, and he wanted to do it violently. Okay? Now, I know it says it opened violently, the execution of preachers who urged reform. Yeah, there was some execution of preachers who were pro-Protestant, but John Knox brought that same kind of reform with him when he came back. He escaped that original persecution, and when he came back, he brought that persecution back with him. So he was the outstanding leader of the Protestant Reformation. He was captured at the castle of St. Andrews. He was forced to serve as a slave on French ships for 19 months. He was released by Edward VI, because Edward VI, remember, was Protestant king. But he fled to Geneva after Edward VI died, because that's right around the time when Mary would have taken the throne. In Geneva, he preached to the English Protestants who were living in exile there. He called Geneva like the place of learning. He was so impressed with it. In 1559, Scottish Protestants called Knox back home to lead them, but they weren't expecting what he brought with them. He was a strong teacher, but he also really pushed the idea that if you were a Catholic, you didn't deserve the same rights as Protestants did. He basically took what the Catholics had been teaching about Protestants and reversed it. And so he went after everybody and everything. And he also had a very strict sense of what was considered appropriate. And he mixed up what the Bible teaches is appropriate or what we need to do versus his personal ideas. So a lot of what he taught was about his personal opinions. And that's where we end up with a lot of people really doing wrong here when it comes to personal opinions. One of his things, he disagreed with the story of Robin Hood because he felt it was too Catholic. And so he closed down the plays of Robin Hood and then punished the actors and the writers and everybody else because he considered them, disseminating Catholic thought. He went after certain dances because he believed that he didn't like the dancing. He went after different music. He went after different art. He went after people who were just gathering in homes and talking about biblical things because they weren't saying exactly what he wanted to say. So he ended up causing a lot of problems in Scotland as well and hurting the Protestant cause more than helping it. Now, there were Protestants who stepped away from him and they started their own Protestant Reformation within the Protestant Reformation, where they tried to just do what the Bible was saying, not what John Knox was preaching as his own religion. Now, Mary Stuart had married Francis II, who had become the king of France, even though he was underage and his mommy was still regent for him. And it was the plan of Mary Stuart's mother to depose Queen Elizabeth and put her daughter on a combined throne for England and Scotland, and using the French help and eventually the Spanish help, they would get rid of Elizabeth and return Scotland and England both to Catholicism. So Mary of Guise, she planned to depose Queen Elizabeth and make her own daughter Queen of England. And then Knox and his followers under heavy attack by French mercenaries, appealed to Queen Elizabeth to intervene for herself and for Scottish Protestants. Since she was a Protestant queen and she was closely connected to Scotland, she was related to Mary of Guise and to Queen Mary of Scotland. They were cousins. She sent 10,000 troops to Scotland, and France withdrew at that point. The woman loved her pearls. Say what you want. She was pearlescent. Now, during this time, Mary of Guise passed away. She left the Scottish Protestants in control. Around the same time, Francis II of France died before he ever came of age where he could rule on his own. And so Mary Stuart was returned to Scotland. She was a Catholic queen of a Protestant country. And the Protestant country of Scotland was being run by the religious leaders, including John Knox. And we're going to stop right there in the middle of all of this turmoil that is very loosely based on religious rights and religious purposes, but in reality has more to do with the political standard of the day. Because as much as we like to talk about John Knox being this great Protestant leader, the truth is he was a political animal, and he was really all about creating Scotland in the image he envisioned for Scotland. Okay, so we're going to stop right there. You can work on your homework a little bit each day, just like you do in the classroom. Don't turn in anything new that I didn't say was due by the 6th, which is today, because I am backlogged with homework. It's just me doing all the grading right now, and it takes a long time to do that. So if it hasn't been due by the 6th, then, and you can go on as far as you want in this book, but if it doesn't have the due date of the 6th on it, just hang on to it and I will get more information to you a little bit later. Okay, that was our lecture for today, and I hope you have a really good week. Well, I'll see you tomorrow though. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good night. Bye.